Hello biology students, and welcome to video 7 in the genetics unit. So in this video we're going to be looking at pedigrees, which are family trees, like this one shown here, used to track the inheritance of a given trait. So before we can start, we have to kind of talk about, well, what is inheritance? And inheritance is the passing of genes from parents to offspring, and pedigrees or family trees are kind of cool because they're a symbolic way of showing how one gene is inherited. You can kind of track it through the family and use it to predict whether or not it will be inherited in the next generation. So a couple things about pedigrees. Whenever you see a square on a pedigree, that's always referring to a male, okay? A circle is a female, and then if the square and circle are filled in, that's telling you that that individual has the phenotype that's being tracked. So a family tree is used, or a pedigree is used to track a given phenotype. So maybe this pedigree might be tracking who has hemophilia, or it might be tracking who has blue eyes, or it might be tracking who has sickle cell anemia. Either way, you have to know what trait you're tracking before you start looking at the pedigree. If you see two linked shapes, that means those people mated. And when you see a line coming off a linkage, that indicated that they had biological children. Now, because we're looking at inheritance, pedigrees only look at biological children, so that they don't look at children who are adopted or anything like that, because that's not actually the passing on of traits. Those of course, are still legitimate children and families. Okay, so depending on what kind of trait we're looking at, the pattern of inheritance could look very different. So for traits that are on the autosomes, so they're not on the sex chromosomes, usually both sexes show these traits equally. So something like blue eyes would probably be seen equally in both females and males in the pedigree. If a trait is autosomal dominant, then every individual who has that trait has a parent who had that trait, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that every generation has to have the trait per se. Like, you could have parents that are heterozygous, that have a child who does not have the trait. But for the most part, we're seeing it in every generation. And then if a trait is autosomal recessive, the big clue to tell if you have an autosomal recessive trait that you're tracking is when you have an individual who has the trait, but the parents do not. The other vocab word you might see before we look at some examples are a carrier. And a carrier is someone who carries the recessive allele. So maybe if I'm looking at eye color and capital B is brown eyes, so it's dominant, and little b is blue, it's recessive, a carrier would be someone who's heterozygous because they're carrying the recessive allele but not showing that trait. Okay, so let's first look at an example of an autosomal recessive pedigree. Okay, so this would be a pedigree where we're tracking a recessive trait that's on an autosome. So maybe something like blue eyes. Okay, so we already know that 2 copies of a recessive allele are needed to show the trait. And kind of the clues, the way you know it's autosomal recessive, if you see equal numbers of males and females who have that trait, that means it's autosomal. And if you see siblings or children who have it but their parents don't, that tells you the trait is recessive. And for example, here, I can see that I have these children who have the trait, so they must be, recessive, so I'll denote it little r. But I know it's recessive and not dominant because I have parents who don't have it. So they must have been heterozygous, right? These 2 parents right here. At autosomal dominant pedigree, we know that you only need 1 copy of the dominant allele to show the phenotype. So the big clues that are it's autosomal dominant is that we see equal numbers of males and females having it, indicating that it's autosomal. And then we see that it's not skipping generations. Basically, if you see it in every generation, that means that it's probably dominant. Because, if it skipped a generation, that means it would have to be recessive, because if it's skipping a generation, it's being masked by the dominant allele. Okay, so some kind of disorders that are autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant. So autosomal recessive disorders include things like being albino, having cystic fibrosis, having sickle cell anemia, or Tay-Sachs. And some dominant disorders that might be tracked in a pedigree are things like Huntington's and Alzheimer's, and dwarfism. Okay. The last type of pedigree that I want to talk about in this video are sex-linked traits. So we know sex-linked traits are traits that are on the sex chromosomes, and we know that they're usually on the X chromosome because X chromosomes have more traits because they're larger. Okay, so the big clue that tells you, if you're looking at a pedigree, and the big clue that will tell you that it's X-linked recessive, is that you will see unequal male-female distribution. Because we know X-linked recessive traits are much easier for males to get than females, because males only need one copy and females need two. Okay? So if a female is a carrier, that would be something like this genotype, where the little r is the disease, right, because it's recessive. She'll give half of her sons the disease because half of her sons will receive that X chromosome, and then she'll make half of her daughters carry the trait. The other big clue that you'll see in an X-linked recessive pedigree is that father-to-son transmission is not present. So in other words, you cannot have a father who has the disease and the mother who does not give you a son who has the disease. And that's because, if you think about it, if a father has the disease, his genotype will be something like this. And fathers, we know, give their sons the Y chromosome. So therefore, they can't pass on that affected allele. Okay. So if we look at a pedigree here, so the half-filled circle is indicating to you where a carrier is, so a woman who's heterozygous. And you can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 men who have the disease, but only 1 woman. So that's a big clue to me that it's X-linked. And then I know it's X-linked recessive, again, because we see this distribution, and we're seeing fathers to son so a father who has the disease never passes it on to the son unless the female's a carrier. So over here, this father and this son both have it, but that's because the mother was a carrier of the trait. Okay. And finally, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is, all along we've been talking about how your genotype influences your phenotype. But it turns out your genes are not the only thing that influence your phenotype. Your phenotype can also be influenced by the environment. So you can think of skin color. You might have the genes to have a very pale skin color, but if you're out in the sun a lot, you might have a darker skin color. So height and weight, you might have the genes to be, very tall in a healthy weight, but if you're malnourished as a child, you might end up being shorter and thinner. And then things like mental disorders and athletic ability, these are other examples of things that are influenced by the environment. So an example not in humans is the Himalayan rabbit, which we actually saw earlier in the year, where basically these rabbits have the genotype to have black fur all over their body. But the black pigment is actually only produced on cold areas of their body, so like their nose, their ears, and their paws. So, in the rest of their body where it's warmer, even though it has the gene to have black fur, they actually have white fur because it's not cold enough for that pigment to be produced. Okay, so we know that both hereditary, or the genes you have, and the environment play a major role in your development of some characteristics. And kind of the way we know this is that if we look at studies of identical twins, they don't have the same phenotype all the time, even though we know they have the same genotypes because they're identical. So for example, IQ scores have been shown to be different between identical twins if they're brought up or raised separately. So we know that IQ must be something that's influenced by the environment. So that's it for video 7, and I'll see you in the next unit.